It's a great crowd this afternoon. Thank you for all joining us. Welcome to the Tabula Poetica reading series. We've had a couple great events already, and today we have C.K. Williams. Our next events are on November 5th, when we welcome poet and psychotherapist Nina Corwin to Chapman University. So come on back for that. That visit is also supported by Schmid College of Science and Technology. Before we get started, make sure you're turning off your cell phone. And while you're doing that, I have a few acknowledgments to share with you. There are a lot of people and organizations and units on campus that support Tabula Poetica, and I just want to mention the most important ones. And the best and brightest is, of course, the English department. And we have the department chair here, Joanna Levin, and I want to thank her specifically. But also our admin, Debbie Thacker, who is over at her desk working hard to make sure that this evening's event comes off well. And also our graduate assistant, Michael Tesoro. Leatherby Libraries and Fish Interfaith Center, where you are now, are providing spaces for most of our events this fall. And the library is hosting this evening's reception, which will get started at about 6:30. So it's a bigger, better reception than we usually have, and you should arrive early for that. And thanks especially to Dean Charlene Baldwin, who's arranged for this reception. The Department of Languages and also poets and writers have provided support for today's poetry events. We have worked with the Chair of Languages, John Boitano, to provide a feature in this fall series that focuses on translation. And today's visiting poet is also a translator. So now I think I'll turn the mic over to Richard Bausch, who teaches in the MFA program. He's a fiction writer, and his most recent book is a collection of stories called Something Is Out There. Welcome, Richard Bausch.
Could you give me that glass of water, please? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Double thank you.
Only man in the country I'd have a glass of water for.
Here, if you need to.
I've known C.K. Williams for 30 years. We were both a lot younger at George Mason University when he became my colleague there. I've been an admirer of his poetry since before I met him. C.K.'s poems are the kind that you read to friends, and I'm going to introduce him to you by saying that another friend of ours, Richard Ford, and I were reading C.K.'s poems to a group of students in my downstairs studio where I lived in Fairfax. And I was going to read C.K.'s poem, My Mother's Lips, which has always been one of my favorite poems, and I hope you'll read it tonight. And Ford wanted to read it, and he reached and lurched to grab the book from me, and his whole weight came against me and broke 2 ribs on the left side of the arm of the sofa I was sitting on. So for years after that, I would call him Bone Crusher Smith, and we would joke about how, Bone Crusher Ford, we would joke about how it was over reading a Charlie Williams poem to a group of students. He is, in my mind, the finest poet alive, and I love his work, and you're in for a wonderful afternoon. C.K. Williams.
Thank you. So I was asked to speak about translation, and I gave a title, Autobiography with Translation, which I actually was an essay I published in my last essay book, which was more technical stuff about translation, but today I'm going to do more of the autobiography part. So I will start. I started writing poetry at the end of my sophomore year in college, and I had no idea why. And the first poem I wrote, I remember taking to a friend of mine's mother, who was the most educated person I knew, and she said, "That's not a poem." And I thought, there's a challenge. So I started becoming more serious about it. And I actually left school for a semester and went to Paris because I thought that's what people do who wanted to be poets. And the problem was that I didn't know how to even begin to go about it. And there's often the first question that's asked in a question and answer period after a reading, especially when they're younger people, is how did you start writing poetry? And I really can't say, but I don't say that, of course. What I say is it was the first adult experience besides sex that I thought had any interest. But at that time, I didn't know anything. So I spent the time in Paris mostly reading novels because I knew how to read a novel. I read everything. I read all of Thomas Wolfe, which none of you will know what that means, but it was thousands and thousands of pages. And then I decided I better go back to school because I don't know anything about poetry. So I came back to school. First, I went to Breadloaf Writers Conference. I saw an advertisement in a newspaper, and I thought, well, that sounds okay. And I wrote a letter, and they said, give us your money and come. And now I find it's really one of the original writers' conference where grown-up writers, I'll call them, come, and apprentices come to study with them. And while I was there, Robert Frost was still there. And I had a romance with Robert Frost's granddaughter, and I gave her my second poem. And she read it, and she said, that's awful. So I was not off to a flying start. But Robert Frost was there. So whose woods these are, I think I know. His houses. I learned some Robert Frost poems. And I went back to school. And I got back to school, so it was really the middle of my junior year. But by then, the beginning of my senior year. And I started taking classes. But in the meantime, in the summer, I was looking for things to read. And there weren't that many not hardbound books in those days. What we call now, we don't even call them now, they were called quality paperbacks. Until then, paperbacks had just been detective stories or science fiction stories. And then they started coming out, and the first quality paperback book that I had was T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which I couldn't understand at all. Although there's a story about that too, which I'll tell tonight. So I started buying any book of poetry that I could, and one of the first books I found was by a poet named Rainer Maria Rilke, who I find out is considered one of the great poets in German of the 20th century. And it was a little book of translations, 50 translations by a translator named C.F. McIntyre, who was a poet who never had much of a career. And I was talking, and his middle name was Maria, so I thought it was a woman. So I kept saying embarrassing things so that, the poet Yeats, it's spelled Y-E-A-T-S. Well, how do you pronounce that if you don't already know? You pronounce it like K-E-A-T-S. So at the Breadloaf Writers Conference, I was saying to someone, well, I really would like to read Yeats. Ha, 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 ha. And Rainer Maria Rilke must be a woman, but it's not. Nobody knows why his mother gave him his middle name, Maria, and his first name was actually René, but he changed it to be more Germanic. So the first poem that I read in his book that I liked was called From a Childhood. It's now considered one of his really unspecial poems, but I still like it. And this is mostly going to be a reading, by the way. So, From a Childhood. The darkness was a richness in the room where the boy sat hidden by himself. And when the mother entered, as in a dream, a thin glass trembled on the silent shelf. She felt as if the room betrayed her, but she kissed her boy and murmured, "Are you here?" Then both glanced shyly at the dark clavier, for often in the evening she would sing a song in which the child was strangely caught. He sat so quietly, his gaze bent low upon her hands, weighed down with heavy rings, moving along the white keys as men go heavily through deep drifts of snow. I still think that's a nice poem. It's not very Rilke, like. Okay. So now I'm going to read another Rilke poem and introduce the subject of translation as a more theoretical problem. Now, I don't read German, so I won't read it in German. I won't read any of the original languages, even the ones I know. This poem was the second poem that sort of blew my mind. I didn't know why, but it did. It's called The Panther, and there's a subtitle, Jardin des Plantes, Paris. His sight from ever gazing through the bars has grown so blunt that it sees nothing more. It seems to him that thousands of bars are before him, and behind them nothing merely. The easy motion of her supple stride, which turns about the very smallest circle, is like a dance of strength about a center in which a mighty will stands stupefied. Only sometimes, when the pupil's film soundlessly opens, then one image fills and glides through the quiet tension of the limbs into the heart and seizes and is still. Okay, now in German, the poem is rhymed. A, B, A, B, A, B. We all know what that means, I presume. When you go to translate a poem that's rhymed, you have, or in any sort of form, you immediately have two issues. You have the issue of, do you try to make convey the form, or do you try primarily, or do you try to convey the information, we'll call it, of the poem? There's a huge ongoing debate among translators as to which you do. MacIntyre changes somewhat the poem from the German a little bit to keep the information, to keep the rhyme, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll read another version of the same poem in which the translator has decided to give the information as scrupulously as possible. The translator's named Stephen Mitchell, The Panther. His vision from the constantly passing bars has grown so weary that it cannot hold anything else. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars, no world. As he paces in cramped circles over and over, the movement of his powerful soft strides is like a ritual dance around a center in which a mighty will stands paralyzed. Only at times the curtain of the pupils lifts quietly, an image enters in, rushes down through the tensed, arrested muscles, plunges into the heart, and is gone. Now, I would bet that on first reading you would like the more formal one. But in fact, when you get into Rilke or into any poet, if you don't have the German, it helps to have someone who's doing the translation as strictly as possible so that you really know what's going on. Then you have people, I'll actually read two more. There was another translator who was the second translator I read, his name was J.B. Leishman, an Englishman who translated all of Rilke. His gaze from those bars keep passing is so misted with tiredness, it can take in nothing more. He feels as though 1,000 bars existed and no more world beyond them than before. You notice he's sort of stretching a little to get the rhyme. He's changing the normal, ordinary syntax. Those supply powerful paddings turning there in the tiniest of circles well might be the dance of forces round a center where some mighty will stands paralytically. He became very famous for making up Rilkean adverbs that didn't exist in English so he could continue to rhyme. Just now and then the pupil's noiseless shutter is lifted, then an image will indart, down through the limbs intensive stillness flutter, and end its being in the heart. All right, so there you have a brief introduction to, I have several more, but I won't read them, some of which become quite silly. You're introduced to, as I say, one of the key problems of translation. Now, we're going to skip way into the future to a contemporary German poet who's considered the greatest German poet of the current generations. He's about 45 now. His name is Durst Grunbein, and he's actually a friend of mine. And he introduced the notion for American poets, Rilke is the great German poet of the 20th century. And he has pointed out that, in fact, in Germany, Rilke isn't considered the greatest German poet of the 20th century. He's not thought of that highly at all, which is a very interesting issue about translation, because Rilke, at least for a while, was the best-selling poet in any language in America, although they were all translations. So I had met Grunbein, and he's a great poet and a great essayist, and I came across a poem of his, which I realized is an attack on Rilke's poem, The Panther. All right, it takes all of Rilke's sort of metaphysical stuff that's a little hard for you to digest as I went by so quickly, and writes his own feline poem, we'll call it, which is quite consciously making fun of Rilke. The poem is called To a Cheetah in the Moscow Zoo. Furs this expensive you normally own, and then keep in mind the Rilke, with the mighty will, paralytically standing, etc., and the supple strides, and furs this expensive you normally only find wrapped around the shoulders of gangsters' malls outside the casino. Movements this slinky only on the catwalk from the androgynous models, eyes dilating in the flashbulbs. As lean a feline as Pisanello once painted with ravish brush, the fur spotted, whiskery, a golden fleece. She sashays swishing up and back. Her spine measures out the least movement. To change direction millimeters in front of the ditch is something for which she doesn't even need eyes. There's nothing out there for the ear or the sensitive nose but the noise and sweat beyond the wire fence where those monkeys congregate. That's us. Where those monkeys congregate with their baby carriages at visiting time. Her breath coming hard, she magics the fator of the metropolis into a charmed ozone, the white ribbons in the girl's hair into strips of gazelle meat. Her fine head, no bigger than your fist, keeps its alert posture as she spies zebras in the flickering at the gates of Moscow. Then she yawns, the prisoner of the cement. Okay, so Rilke at that time, as you gather, was for a while my very favorite poet. But I began to study other poets in other languages. And at the university then, I took a course actually in W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, which introduced me to them, especially Yeats, who became one of my masters along with Rilke. More so a master because, of course, he's writing in the same language. But at the same time, a French poet arrives, Charles Baudelaire, who was the great revolutionary poet of the 19th century. Now, not only was he a revolutionary poet, he really introduces the world to modernism. Now, we go back to Rilke. Rilke is writing a book in about 1907 about a young man who's living alone in Paris, obviously based on Rilke, and it's called The Notebooks of Malta Loridzbriga. And reading it, you come across a poem by Charles Baudelaire, and the young poet is revolutionized by this poem. And when I read it, I was revolutionized by it too. It changes one's whole, and it really changed the conception of art, what art could be. It really takes art out of the realm of the beautiful, the ephemeral, the abstract, and brings it down to the sheer transformative power of art. Art is about transformation. And the way Baudelaire went about it was he took subjects that were not considered feasible for poetry, ugly things, hideous things, and made them into beautiful poetry. That's a very simplified description of what he does. And this is the poem that is the poem that the Rilke character, the Rilke autobiographical stand-in, responds to so strongly, and which I did too. It's called Carrion. This is a translation by someone named Francis Duke. There are literally hundreds of translations of this poem. It's very hard to translate, but he does a pretty good job. Carrion. Recall, my soul, the thing that we one morning found beneath a smiling summer sky, the gruesome carrion, which where the path swung round upon a gravel bank hard by, lay like some wanton, legs stiff, poised in torrid air, exuding poisonous liquescence, inventing, seemingly cynically not to care, a bellyful of foul putrescence. The sun's hot rays across that rotting body rolled as though to roast it, till well done, and give great nature back again an hundredfold what she had first created one. And heaven watched that carcass arrogantly swell as flowers blossom with so rank a stench that as you breathed it in, you all but fell a swoon upon the grass-grown bank. Flies hummed a droning burden from the putrid belly, whence marched as on parade black threads of maggots, flowing forward like a liquid jelly and vivifying lifeless shreds. In wave-like cadences the mass sagged back, then humped and spurted forth like spindrift flying, while with a vague afflatus filled the body jumped as though alive and multiplying. And from that world there rose a weirdly rhythmic strain of melody, evocative of running waters, breezes, or the winnower's grain being swirled and shaken in the sieve. The forms grew indistinct and seemed to have been but dreamed, a sketch slow coming theretofore, abandoned on the canvas and at last redeemed in memory and nothing more. A bitch uneasily on watch beyond the stones, with eyeballs anger-reddened, glowered at us and bode her time to scavenge from the bones some gobbet dangling undevoured. You too shall come to be like that, the same carrion, that same detestable infection. So shall you be, star of mine eyes, my nature's sun, and mine angelic predilection. Aye, Queen of Graces, such shall be your final doom, when after all the sacraments you too shall lie beneath lush growing grass and bloom within your moldering cerements. Then shall you, O my beauty, to the vermin swarm, whose kisses shall devour you, say that I'll have kept the sacred essence and the form of love's long fallen into decay. So he uses all the conventions of a love poem, the meter of a love poem, the way the poem moves and coming back to you from somewhere far away, except the you that it's come to is quite hideous. But when you read the poem, in the original especially, but even in the translation, it's quite a thrilling experience. But at the same time, not so thrilling. Now, a little lecture on translation. There are certain times in cultures when poetry exhausts itself. It doesn't happen a lot, and we'll call it language cultures. Styles change pretty regularly in poetry. You go from the Renaissance, well, we'll skip around. My Renaissance, 18th century, 19th century, it keeps changing, but within various forms. Now, when you get to the Renaissance, English poetry changes radically. It changes radically with Sir Philip Sidney and Sir Thomas Wyatt, and the Earl of Surrey, primarily. most people reading an anthology of English poetry of the Renaissance won't realize that some of the most esteemed poems are actually translations. So there's a poem of Thomas Wyatt, whoso lists to hunt, I know where is a hound, but as for me, alas, I may no more. And it's a gorgeous poem. Well, it turns out it was a translation from Petrarch. Now, why would someone go to a translation and bring it into English, which already had a poetic culture? And what had happened, the poetic culture compresses on itself and somehow loses its essential energy. And at moments like that, it doesn't happen often, the poetic culture reaches out and finds other cultures. Now, when I began to write in the 1950s and early 60s, the accepted poetic culture was a very, very strict, formal kind of poetry, very metrical rhyme, very intellectual, very abstract. I used to read it and think, I don't understand this stuff. And when you picked up a literary magazine, that's what was in it. Now, at the same time, there were poets writing who weren't doing that, but I hadn't heard about them yet, like William Carlos Williams, particularly, and Allen Ginsberg, and Robert Lowell had begun. And for me, I just couldn't understand that. And suddenly, there began to arrive poems in translation. And during the early part of the 1960s, it became clear that English poetry was revivifying itself. It was reaching out to other cultures to find new life, new forms, new sounds, new ways to think. And it actually happens in other cultures too. In many of the Spanish cultures, poetry cultures of the 20th century, the discovery of Walt Whitman, the great American poetry, changed the native poetry radically. With us, it was the opposite. We had Whitman. We didn't quite know what to do with Whitman. We still don't, if the truth be known. But we suddenly began to find these poems coming from other languages. At first, very much from Spanish, interestingly. And there were many, the magazines that had been publishing this very stilted English American poetry now would be filled with translations. Sometimes the whole issue of some magazines would be translations. And I read these poems with incredible excitement. Suddenly there was a way to think about the world, to think about poetry that wasn't abstract, that was fiercely concrete, and at the same time very exciting. And two of the great poets of that time, whom I read, one was Pablo Neruda, and I'll read a poem of his. I would have read two if I had, because there's one that I'm going to read. It's called Sexual Water. Okay, and then he has another poem called Gentleman Without Company, Caballero Solo, which is another sexual poem. But this one is great because you'll see what it does to ordinary thought. Okay, somebody says, all right, write me a poem about sex. Now, if you were a 1956 American poet, you begin to think about philosophical notions of sex and how to imagine I don't know what, but here comes this guy, Sexual Water, rolling down in big and distinct drops, and drops like teeth, and heavy drops like marmalade and blood, rolling down in big drops. The water is falling like a sword made of drops, like a river of glass that tears things. It is falling, biting, beating on the axle of symmetry, knocking on the seams of the soul, breaking abandoned things, soaking the darkness. It is nothing but a breath, more full of moisture than crying, a liquid, a sweat, an oil that has no name, a sharp motion taking shape, making itself thick. The water is falling in slow drops toward the sea, toward its dry ocean, toward its wave without water. I look at the wide summer and a loud noise coming from a barn, wine shop, cicadas, towns, excitements, houses, girls sleeping with hands over their heart, dreaming of pirates, of conflagrations. I look at ships. I look at trees of bone and marrow bristling like mad cats. I look at blood, daggers, and women's stockings and men's hair. I look at beds. I look at corridors where a virgin is sobbing. I look at blankets and organs and hotels. I look at secretive dreams. I let the straggling days come in, and the beginnings also, and memories also, like an eyelid held open hideously. I am watching. And then this sound comes, a red noise of bones, a sticking together of flesh, and legs yellow as wheat heads meeting. I am listening among the explosion of the kisses. I am listening shaken among breathings and sobs. I am here watching listenings with half of my soul at sea and half of my soul at land. And with both halves of my soul, I watch the world. And even if I close my eyes and cover my heart over entirely, I see the monotonous water falling in big monotonous drops. It is like a hurricane of gelatin, like a waterfall of sperm and sea anemones. I see a clouded rainbow hurrying. I see its water moving over my bones. Now, if someone had assigned you in class to write a poem about sex, do you think you could come up with that? Neither did I. I thought, this is the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. I was so excited, and Neruda was an astonishing poet. He wrote thousands and thousands of poems. His poems were very popular. He was from Chile. He was so popular, he became a senator at one point. He was a communist. When I have one of my closest friends is a Polish poet who lived through the worst, named Adam Zagajewski, who lived through the worst of the time of communism in Poland. And it took him a long time to accept that Neruda might be a great poet because he was a communist. And I had to explain to him that in Latin America at that time, that's still true to some extent, you were either a rightist or a communist. There was no such thing as a liberal Democrat or even a Tea Party Republican. No, all right, there was no such thing as a liberal Democrat. All right, sideline from a moment for that. That was translated by a great American poet named James Wright. Now, James Wright had begun as a regular 1950s poet, writing in form very, very well, with subject matter that was more, let's call it ruthless, than the typical poems that were being written. But what happened then was that there began to appear in English, or there began to be paid attention to in English, a lot of translations from the Chinese and Japanese. And both traditions were very spare and compressed. Because now these 1950s American poems often rambled on, not the way Neruda explodes on. And Wright came across them, and he and another poet named Robert Bly became very interested in it and began to compress their own poems. First of all, especially Wright, took them out of form, began using free verse, and modeling their sort of scope on Chinese poetry, which in fact is very formal, but in a different way. For translators, it's maddeningly formal. It's impossible to translate. The poems are all written in squares, with the square of the characters make a square, and that's like a sonnet, except it's just a square. So how can you translate that? You can't. But what came across, and I also then began to come across these poems, it was terribly exciting to have all the mechanisms of poetry taken out and just to see the essence of the poem. There were two poets from the 7th century or 8th century, Li Po and Du Fu, who are considered the great Chinese poets of the time, Du Fu especially. Li Po was an alcoholic. He supposedly drowned trying to fill his glass from the moon, the reflection of the moon in a lake. He was in a boat, which can't be true. But here's one of his very, very short poems, Jade Staircase Grievance. Night long on the jade staircase, white dew appears, soaks through gauze stockings. She lets down crystalline blinds, gazes out through jewel lacework at the autumn moon. I'll read it again. Night long on the jade staircase, white dew appears, soaks through gauze stockings. She lets down crystalline blinds, gazes out through jewelry lacework at the autumn moon. Now, if you start figuring out what that's about, it's about a woman standing on a staircase at night when there's dew, on a jade staircase, which means she's wealthy or a noble woman. White dews appear, she's wearing gauze stockings, meaning she's partly undressed. Who's she waiting for? She's obviously waiting for her lover. All right, at some point in the night, she realizes that her lover isn't coming. She lets down the blinds and looks through the blinds at the autumn moon in hopelessness and despair and rejection. So all that in about 25 words or 30 words. Now that began to be a huge influence on American poetry. By the end of the 1960s, nobody was writing in this old way. Everybody was compressing things, bringing things down, turning to the Latin Americans for this incredible metaphoric work that they were doing. I won't read another poem by Dufour because I'm reading too many. But I'll go back to another poet who was terrifically important for me among the Latin Americans, a Peruvian, another communist, named Cesar Vallejo, who was very poor, the son of a miner. He spent some time in jail in Peru, ended up in Paris, went to Moscow, was very disappointed with that, but he couldn't say that much. Wrote some wonderful poems about the Spanish Civil War. And his first book is called Los Heraldos Negros, the Black Riders. And this poem became, for me, the term in literature is touchstone. It became somewhere where I could keep my hand on it and reach out into the world and feel this connection between the force of this poet's vision and my own groping through the world. This is a translation by Robert Bly, who was James Wright's friend, and they actually published little books together. So there was a book called 20 Poems of Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda, which is where I first found this. And Bly translates it, there's a phrase, a line that ends, yo no sé. Everybody knows what that means. It means, I don't know. And Bly translates it as I can't answer, which is fine. But I translated it as, anybody got another translation of yo no sé? I translated it as don't ask. There are blows in life so violent, don't ask. Blows as if from the hatred of God, as if before them the deep waters of everything lived through were backed up in the soul. Don't ask. Not many, but they exist. They open dark ravines in the most ferocious face and in the most bull-like back. Perhaps they are the horses of that heathen Attila or the black riders sent to us by death. They are the slips backward made by the Christs of the soul, away from some holy faith that is sneered at by events. These blows that are bloody are the crackling sounds from some bread that burns at the oven door. And man, poor man, he swings his eyes as when a man behind us calls us by clapping his hands, swings his crazy eyes, and everything alive is backed up like a pool of guilt in that glance. There are blows in life so violent, don't ask. Do we have any Spanish native-speaking people here? Anybody who can read Spanish as their native language? Okay, if there were, I would ask someone to read it in Spanish. Can you read it for us in Spanish? stand up. Did it? The Spanish part, all of it, yeah.
Hay golpes en la vida tan fuertes, yo no sé, golpes como del odio de Dios, como si antes ellos, la resaca de todo lo sufrido, se empureza en el alma, yo no sé, son pocos pero abren zanjas oscuras en el rostro más fiero, en el lomo más fuerte, serán tal vez los potros de bárbaros Atinas, o los heraldos negros que nos manda la muerte. Son las caídas hondas de los cristos del alma, de alguna fe adorable que el destino blasfema. Esos golpes sangrientos son las crepitaciones de algún pan que en la puerta del horno se nos quema. Y el hombre, pobre, vuelve los ojos, como cuando por sobre el hombro nos llama una palmada. Vuelve los ojos locos y todo lo vivido se empoza como un charco de culpa en la mirada. Hay golpes en la vida tan fuertes, yo no sé.
Keep it. It's for you. It's sort of thrilling to hear it in the original, actually. All right, I didn't realize I'm running out of time. So I want to read some other poems that were important to me. Okay, so Vietnam War, 1966. Robert Bly, who just translated that poem, started what were called read-ins. A bunch of poets would go to universities, hook up with poets who were at the universities, and have anti-war protests that consisted of the reading of poems. Often they were poems from some of these Latin American or European cultures that had experienced oppression and injustice and absurdity. And these read-ins also, because they often used translation, became another huge force on American poetry. So that, as I said, by the end of the 1960s, everybody was writing, having been influenced by these translations. Now, some of the translations which were most crucial came from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, which then were, as I said about my friend Adam Zagajewski, suffering from oppression themselves. And they had very tricky problems because unless they left the country, they couldn't write actively against the regimes. Or a great example of someone who did was Joseph Brodsky, the great Russian poet who had his citizenship revoked and was exiled. And even he never wrote really directly about the oppression. Now, one of the great poets of the 20th century is a Polish poet named Zbigniew Herbert, who I had the fortune of meeting. All right, so he wants to talk about torture, oppression, arrogance, political harshness. So how does he do it? All right. He takes an ancient myth about Apollo and Marsyas. Now, Apollo and Marsyas, Apollo was the god of music. Marsyas was a poet, a musician. And Marsyas challenges Apollo to a contest to see who's the better musician. Of course, Apollo wins. And what he does to punish Marsyas is he hangs him up and he strips his skin off, which is quite a horrible thing to have done to you, as you might imagine. So here's the way Herbert, in what's considered his most influential poem, deals with this myth and incorporates the crisis of his society at the same time. Apollo and Marsyas. The real duel of Apollo with Marsyas, absolute ear versus immense range, takes place in the evening when, as we already know, the judges have awarded victory to the god. Bound tight to a tree, meticulously stripped of his skin, Marsyas howls. Before the howl reaches his tall ears, he's a half-human creature, so he's like a satyr. Before the howl reaches his tall ears, he reposes in the shadow of that howl, shaken by a shudder of disgust. Apollo is cleaning his instrument. Only seemingly is the voice of Marsyas monotonous and composed of a single vowel, A. In reality, Marsyas relates the inexhaustible wealth of his body, bold mountains of liver, white ravines of aliment, rustling forests of lung, sweet hillocks of muscle, joints, bile, blood, and shudders, the wintry wind of bone over the salt of memory, shaken by a shudder of disgust. Apollo is cleaning his instrument. Now to the chorus is joined the backbone of Marsyas, in principle the same A, only deeper with the addition of rust. This is already beyond the endurance of the god with nerves of artificial fiber. Along a gravel path hedged with box, the victor departs, wondering whether out of Marsyas's howling there will not someday arise a new kind of art, let us say concrete. Suddenly at his feet falls a petrified nightingale. He looks back and sees that the hair of the tree to which Marsyas was fastened is white completely. All right, another, I know we're getting to the end. There's a few more that I'd like to read that I'll go a little bit out of the context of translation. The greatest poem to come out of what we now call the Holocaust, although it wasn't called the Holocaust then, was a poem called Death Fugue by a poet named Paul Celan, who was originally from Romania but wrote in German. His native language was German, whose parents died in the Holocaust, and he managed to escape, ended up in Paris, became known for his great poetry, ended up in a state of extreme depression and killed himself, as too many survivors of the Holocaust did. This poem is considered the greatest poem to come out of the Holocaust, and it's very interesting because it's unlike any other poem he ever wrote. His other poems were very dense, tight, almost unreadable in translation or in the German, but very precious and valued. And this poem became so popular that he actually stopped allowing it to appear in anthologies, because he was known by this one poem that in fact didn't represent his poetry. It only represented this historical moment and represented it in such an astounding way. Now, there have been many translations of this poem. This translation is by someone named John Felstener, who's a very good translator. He is a translator of Neruda as well. And he had the brilliant idea in translating this poem from the German to leave a few phrases in German. Now, my German isn't so good, but it was the great stroke of translating in the 20th century, to leave this poem that's about the Germans, about what they did, and leave a few innocent lines in German. So it's called Death Fugue. Black milk of daybreak. You have to sort of put in mind a concentration camp and the images of concentration camp. They don't come to you immediately in the poem, but when you get to, of course, you never read a poem once. You read it first to find your way through it, and then you read it again to try to experience it. So I'm giving you a little hint, since I'm only reading it once, to have in mind the image of concentration camps, those dark, shadowed places with barbed wire. Okay. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning. We drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie, too cramped. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarita. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows, has them shovel a grave in the ground. He commands us play up for the dance. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at morning and midday. We drink you at evening. We drink and we drink. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland. Your golden hair, Margareta. Your ashen hair, Shulamith. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie, too cramped. Your ashen hair, Shulamith. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie, too cramped. He shouts, jab this earth deeper, you lot there. You others, sing up and play. There were orchestras in the concentration camp of prisoners, that the Germans formed orchestras and made them play. And people took the chance to do something besides die. He shouts, jab this earth deeper, you lot there. You others, sing up and play. He grabs for the rod in his belt. He swings it. His eyes are so blue. Jab your spades deeper, you lot there. You others, play on for the dancing. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at midday and morning. We drink you at evening. We drink and we drink. A man lives in your house, your goldenest haar, Margarita, your ashenest haar, Shulamith. He plays with his vipers. He shouts, play death more sweetly. This death is a master from Deutschland. He shouts, scrape your strings darker. You'll rise then as smoke to the sky. You'll have a grave then in the clouds. There you won't lie, too cramped. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night. We drink you at midday. Death is a master aus Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning. We drink and we drink. This death is ein Master ein Deutschland. His eye, it is blue. He shoots you with shot made of lead shoots, you level and true. A man lives in the house, your goldenest haar, Margarita. He loosens his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays with his vipers and daydreams. Der Tag ist dein Meister aus Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarita, dein ashenes Haar, Shulamith. That's quite a poem, isn't it? I heard a recording of him reading it. The translator actually had a recording, and it was just heartbreaking. Well, we're out of time, so I'll end with, I finally became a translator myself. And I translated, oh my goodness, did I lose it? I translated some Greek tragedies, which is my main translating work. And I translated some poems of a book of my Polish friend, Adam Zagiewski, but I can't find it. I can't find the poem I brought of his, but I'll end with one little poem from the French, from a great French poet named Francis Ponge, who I translated in the 1980s, and who became a revivified force in my vision of poetry. He was a poet I hadn't studied until I translated him. He wrote mostly in prose poetry. And the poem is called The Pleasures of the Door. Kings never touch doors. They're not familiar with this happiness, to push gently or roughly before you one of these great friendly panels, to turn towards it, to put it back in place, to hold a door in your arms. The happiness of seizing one of these tall barriers to a room by the porcelain knob of its belly. This quick hand-to-hand during which your progress slows for a moment, your eye opens up and your whole body adapts to its new apartment. With a friendly hand, you hold on a bit longer before firmly pushing it back and shutting yourself in, of which you are agreeably assured by the click of the powerful, well-oiled latch. Thank you.
I do want to leave a little time in case some of you have books and will not be able to be at the evening reading or have individual questions. But we do have a couple of minutes if you have a question that we all might want to hear the answer. A question?
I answered every possible
I
question
think
during
you
my...
must have. Here's a question. So if you liked these poems, wait till you hear the poems tonight that are by C.K. Williams.
They're not as great, I have to warn you. I mean, I gave you the top
Can you
there.
talk a little bit, though, about the difference as a writer between writing your own original poems and translating someone else's work? I know that could be a whole part two of the talk.
It's
but-
a whole part two of the talk. It's completely different, but you learn a lot from it.
Okay.
I'll just
In
leave
both
it at
directions,
no.
probably. No?
In the direction of translating toward your poetry. Well, of course, you learn about you learn the craft of translation by learning the craft of writing poetry. That's true. So if you're not, that's another big issue in the field of translation. Can non-poets translate poetry? And it's rare that they can. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. Thanks to
Thank
C.K.
you.
Williams. See you all tonight, I hope.